And now, Buddhologists, we've come a long way in the journey of global Buddhism. Starting in India, of course, with the Buddha, we saw the amazing developments in early Indian Buddhism and the formation of critical philosophy that will travel everywhere throughout the Buddhist world. And then in northwest India, nearing Central Asia, modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan and the like, we saw in our third unit the emergence of the Mahayana, which will be even more merchant-friendly, layperson-friendly, and women-friendly as well. It is, again, the liberal wing of Buddhism. We saw with the emergence of Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia that the emphasis is on conserving the original tradition. But with the Mahayana, we'll see that go out the window, as we say. And many new developments will take place in China primarily. Just as Sri Lanka was the headquarters for Theravada Buddhism, China is the headquarters for East Asian Mahayana Buddhism, for it is the Chinese model that will travel to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. So while the origins of Buddhism are said to be held in the dream of a Chinese emperor 2,000 years ago, in fact, it was merchants traveling along the Silk Road and trading through the sea routes that brought Buddhism to China and began what is effectively the Indianification of Chinese culture. So this is the origins of spices and the like in Chinese food as India transforms the society through the Sanskrit language sacred to Mahayana traditions. And primarily we'll see it's the change in form that really stands out. There are no new ideas, radically new ideas in Buddhism outside of India. We can see in the peak period of the Kushana Empire, Central Asian peoples slowly converting to Buddhism, among these the Tibetans. And along the Silk Road are many famous translation centers. Among these, Dunhuang in China is perhaps the most famous treasure trove of early Mahayana scriptures in a variety of languages. In Dunhuang, the Cave of 1,000 Buddhas, will see the world's first printed book. Well, it's not quite a book, but it is a printed text. The Diamond Sutra was the first to be impressed with a wood block onto paper, allowing for the publishing of numerous more texts than ever before was possible. Meanwhile, in India itself, we see the beginning incursions of Muslim conquerors who eventually will take over all of India with the Mughal Empire. And as, in particular, Turkish Muslims invaded India, they saw Buddhism as a religion of idolatry. In fact, the word in Islam for an idol is Bud. And in China itself, Buddhism was known as the religion of images. So with Buddhism, like Hinduism, we see a big emphasis on visual, graphic presentations. Buddhism will serve as a civilizing influence where it goes in most of Asia, not India. It was already civilized from 5,000 years ago. Not China, because 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, China was also a civilization. But in some areas of Central Asia, Tibet, Mongolia, Manchuria, as we saw in Southeast Asia, Hindu traders will civilize the nation. And civilize just means living in cities. It doesn't mean people are bad if they're not civilized. It means they have a scripture, laws, and all of these accoutrements of culture that we call civilization. For the Chinese mind, India was a fabulous and magical land, and Buddhism itself was a newbie. Many Chinese explorers will travel to India looking for the true Buddhism. Among these, Fashan and Xuanzang, famous for the journey to the West and the movie Monkey and the like, will travel for 16 years among the Buddhist nations of Asia, chronicling and describing everything he saw and bringing back authoritative translations, as he thought, of Buddhist texts. His translations will eventually become authoritative in China. Of course, when we mention China was civilized already, it had two powerful ideological presences, or should I say religions, or worldviews is the better word. The Taoist worldview eschewed society. One should live simply in nature, in balance and harmony of yin and yang, or male and female, light and dark, and all polar opposites should be blended into one's own awareness. Taoist tradition will not conflict with Buddhism theoretically as much as the polar opposite in China, Confucian tradition, or the scholarly tradition, which will emphasize the importance of civilization and a well-run, well-ordered society. Confucianism, which inherently put women in second spot, will conflict with Buddhism throughout these centuries, and yet at the same time we'll see Taoism, Confucianism blend with Buddhism. And this makes China an odd one out in the history of global Buddhism because of these Chinese admixtures. In particular, a Taoist emphasis on the body in harmony with nature is going to influence, in particular, the Chan sect, meditation sect, dhyana in Sanskrit, which will pick up martial arts, evolving into the famous, at least in America, Shaolin fighting monk traditions. I've asked students in Thailand, are there any fighting monks in Thailand? And the question is ridiculous, because of course not. Monks aren't supposed to fight. But we'll see as Buddhism evolves and changes, it won't be the same Theravada Buddhism that we got to know in the first 2 units. Confucianism, contrary to Buddhism, is built on the inequality of people rather than the equality. So a father is inherently superior to his sons, the sons to their sisters, oldest son to youngest son, and I think you get the idea. So Confucianism and Buddhism are often at odds in China. Buddhism in particular presented a challenge for Taoists. Some Taoists thought that, in fact, the Buddha was the reincarnation of Lao Tzu in the heavenly kingdom, one word for India among the Chinese, because their doctrines were so similar, or so they thought at first. Both are relatively egalitarian. Both place women on a relatively equal level. Both seek escape from society and will blame society for many of the evils that humans endure. But then often I heard East Asian Buddhists and Buddhist scholars talk about the positive view of East Asian Buddhism compared to the world-denying Theravada traditions in their opinion. And this positive evaluation of nature and the world may well be due to the Taoist background of the Chinese. Of course, there's no idea of yin or yang in traditional Buddhism, but we'll see that re-emerge in the next unit on Tantric Buddhism. And then finally, instead of going with the flow of nature, Buddhists seek mindful awareness of their mind and body in this realm. So for Confucius, the family was the source of all goodness in society. It was the concentric golden rings of the local family to the village, to the province, to the emperor and the whole nation of China that serves as the fulcrum of all things for Confucianism. And we may recall Buddha left his own wife and kid and kingdom behind, and this creates inherent conflicts with the political order in China for many Buddhist sects. Again, this open welcome to women, this disturbed the Confucian thinkers, even though today, arguably, China has the strongest presence of women bhikshunis or nuns. And of course, the Confucian pragmatists, they don't build temples to Confucius or the like. They build government buildings. So building monasteries and lavish temples was a big waste of money, just so men could gaze at their navels, is how they thought about meditation. The Sangha, the community of monks and nuns, became a haven for the dispossessed, the orphan, the widow, people needing food. Even today, Buddhist monasteries are a drop-off point for unwanted or injured animals in Theravada, Thailand. We saw in our fourth unit that it was from Sri Lankan bhikshunis in Sanskrit, who traveled from Sri Lanka to establish the formal order of Buddhist nuns. And just like in India, as we saw in the poems of the Therigatha, the poems of the elder nuns, freedom from household, the opportunity to get a living, to be your own person and no longer subject to your husband as you were in Confucian society. All of these things appealed to Buddhism for women. The earliest period of the advent of Buddhism into China we call the Go-Yi period. This is the exchange of terms as Buddhists tried to translate their language into this new culture. Since the time of that reformer Xuanzang, this is all codified using largely Sanskrit terms. But in the beginning, we saw words like Bodhi and awakening translated as the Tao, or the sense of Wu as nothing, standing in for Shunyata. Just as in the early period, Christian missionaries tried to translate the word Dharma and use the word law with a capital L because they didn't have a word in their culture for a word as complex in meaning as Dharma. So this happens in every culture. But the terminology was all established by the 5th century or so, with Xuanzang in the 7th century really creating what we call authoritative translations. This early period, sometimes Buddhologists refer to as the Buddho-Taoist period. We have translators arriving from Central Asia, the Kushana Empire we discussed, engaging in early translations such as Kumarajiva or Lokakshema, whose translations, though considered more poetic by some, will lose their value as authoritative in time. And it is again Xuanzang, perhaps the most famous of Chinese Buddhists in history, who will spend 16 years traveling through Central Asia and south, and even see the Theravada headquarters in Kanchi, but not to mention Nalanda. And he describes all these in vivid detail that has allowed Buddhologists to reconstruct even India's Buddhist past. This period of Xuanzang in the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries were really the heyday of Buddhism in China, to the point that China's only woman emperor was the very devout Empress Wu Zetian, who will give Buddhism enormous amounts of money to build monastic institutions, and the famous wonder of the ancient world, the multi-mirrored hall of Fazan. His Buddhist doctrine, again from Central Asia, but he expands it, is that we live in a holographic universe where every consciousness reflects every other consciousness, just like mirrors in his fabled hall, where when one entered, one saw a Buddha with a candle lit in the middle, and oneself and that Buddha all infinitely displayed in the mirrored hall. We'll see Buddhism emerge in various art and poetry works. Buddhism is almost seen as an aesthetic, an Indian aesthetic, more than an ideology meant to empower the common person, as the Sangha was for the lower classes who, again, as in India and everywhere Buddhism goes, could get an education in the monastery. In the city, we see giant elite monasteries, very lavish and fancy. But then in China, as everywhere, there are wilderness traditions where the real monks go to practice, and likewise in the forests as well. So Buddhism will exist at all levels of Chinese society, and when Buddhism is in its cultural heyday, there was no need to defer to the emperor. In this period of Buddho-Taoism, the two truths we discussed in our third unit, the conventional and ultimate, are translated and understood by Taoists as the manifest Tao, that we can see this world, and the unmanifest Tao, that we cannot perceive. And the Chinese will evolve a one-mind view whereby all beings share one vast consciousness, rather than the individualistic focus we saw was true in early Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism. So throughout China, we'll see an oscillation then between pro-Buddhist and anti-Buddhist camps, asserting Buddhist power and then being deposed from power in China as it slowly converts to Buddhism, a process we could compare to the advent of Christianity in Europe, where a Jewish religion is confronted with a Greco-Roman society that's so at odds with it, and yet they blend and merge into mega institutions on our planet. So one thing about Buddhism entering your country late is that you get all the schools. When Buddhism enters the United States and Europe, all the schools go, and the same was true in China. So while Theravada was never dominant, it was present in China, the conservative Buddhism of South and Southeast Asia. But in fact, the Madhyamaka school, the Yogacara school, these all came to China. The Tantric school will be there in China. It still exists in Japan, but Tantric Buddhism was a bit much for the Chinese culture, and it never became vast, and it did die out eventually. But two will persist, two we really want to look at. The Sukhavati school, also known as Pure Land, and the Dhyana school, known through its Japanese term Zen, the Chinese Chan, and then meditation sect Buddhism, is what most of the Western world kind of identifies, maybe not correctly, as Buddhism, because of the influence of China in global culture. So, if Theravada Buddhism is based on the sutras and the Vinaya and the Abhidharma, Chinese Buddhism is especially focused on the sutras, or what the Buddha taught. But these are the, one might say, made-up sutras of Central Asia. So while words are put into the mouth of the Buddha, he didn't really say most of those. They are elaborations from original Buddhist texts. And in East Asia, it's kind of well known for the theory of Buddha nature. The Buddha nature is thought to be a pure potential for awakening within every being. The Tathagata Garbha, the womb or embryo of the thus gone Buddha, the Tathagata. Critical Buddhists will say this doctrine looks a lot like the Atman or permanent soul of Hinduism. It's not Buddhist. But then that's a debate for others to have. The point is, it is a fact that countless Chinese Buddhists believed in the existence of the Tathagata Garbha, the Buddha nature. So among these sutras is the Mahayana Shraddha Utpada Sutra, the awakening of faith in the Mahayana, where we read Theravada Buddhism is insufficient. Madhyamaka is deemed a kind of nihilism incompatible with the Buddha nature, that pure Buddha within. And Yogacara from India, this philosophy was focused on the individual and not the collective consciousness, more important to many of these Chinese sects. For in many of these sects, we don't have an individual mind. We share a global, universal consciousness, not something the Buddha taught. Then the Pure Land Sukhavati Buddhism. Sukhavati is Sanskrit meaning possessing happiness. So rather than the word Pure Land, it's better to translate it as Happiness Buddhism. Many practitioners, and I've met them, look down on the Pure Land tradition. The Pure Land tradition and the Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra focus on a cosmic Buddha named Amitabha, or immeasurable light awakening, Amitabha Buddha awakening. And it's thought that this being was once human, even before that was once an animal, but through trillions of lifetimes evolved into a cosmic Buddha with such great compassion that through its vast consciousness it can summon beings up to its sort of heaven, its pure land, its happiness realm without any work. It's a religion of grace, if you will, in Buddhism. The idea is that individuals possess selfishness, and when they give up their self-power over to the other power of the universe and immeasurable light, that then their self dissolves and they make this world the Pure Land. So it's more Buddhist than many Buddhists think. It's not just pie in the sky when you die, religion of grace. So this Pure Land Buddhism, this happiness Buddhism, sees the current epoch as degenerate, the evil age, the Japanese call Ma-Po in modern Pure Land tradition there. And along with the Chan sect, this sect will be so popular among the peasantry that it will stick with them all the way up through modern times, where even Chairman Mao's own mother is a practitioner of this Buddhism. It will never be part of the elite structure of Chinese society, however, but like the Chan tradition, it will survive the persecution of the 9th century that we'll talk about momentarily. So then, during the Tang Dynasty, we'll see Buddhism will have peaked in the 6th, 7th, and 8th century, but then in the end, Emperor Wuzong, based on the advice of Taoist advisors, that if he wants to seek immortality, he must remove black, meaning Buddhism, from China. And with that, he begins this persecution of Buddhism, that will result in the destruction of at least 4,600 monasteries. So while in this period we can call the great systematization of Buddhist schools, so we'll look at a few of these, and among them is famously the Tiantai, or Heavenly Terrace School. This school was based on the Lotus Sutra. We saw some themes of which from the third unit, and primarily the idea of Ekayana, or one vehicle for all beings. There is no Theravada or Mahayana or Vajrayana. In the end, there's only one vehicle to Buddhahood. Was one of the many teachings of this school, along with, of course, the increasingly popular doctrine among Chinese Buddhist schools, the notion of one mind for the universe. As we saw in the Theravada and the Mahayana, we'll see it continuing the development of classification systems to classify the many Buddhist sects from least intelligent, can we say, to most accurate and definitive at the top. So the Chinese term for this kind of system is Panchao. We saw Buddhaghosa do this in the Theravada world with the Visuddhimagga, the idea of a path through stages to awakening. And the Nirvana Sutra uses the example of milk. There is ghee, clarified butter at the top, and below that, whole milk, and at the bottom are the curds, the dregs, if you will, of Buddhist traditions. Another big controversy, not only in China, but as we'll see in Central Asia, is the dispute between whether awakening is sudden or gradual. The Indian bias is to take the gradualist approach to awakening, while in China and Taoism, there already was an idea of instantaneous awareness arising spontaneously. And so for the Zen tradition, awakening is sudden and instant. There are examples in the Japanese Zen tradition of a monk burning the scriptures to show their valuelessness in the face of direct awareness of the Dharmadhatu, the reality of the universe, if we could but see it purely. Most of Buddhism, like the Theravada and the Indian traditions, will go for the gradualist approach, that through lifetimes and through gradual training, we will continue to expand our consciousness into full awakening. Then with the Garland School, based on the Avatamsaka Sutra, we may recall the Yogacara 5 consciousnesses of the senses, the 6th of the mental consciousness that collates all these images, then the ego consciousness, finally the basal consciousness that contains our dreams and seeds for future lifetimes. But then, in addition to the 8th, this school will develop the idea of the Amala Vijnana, or the stainless awareness, a level of consciousness that didn't exist in the Indian world. And this will feed also into the Buddha nature, or Tathagata Garbha doctrine that is, again, so prevalent and popular in East Asian Buddhism. This holographic school teaches that all aspects of the universe attain awakening together. So it's a collective approach, and they all reflect each other. There is nothing existing apart from this mutual reflection of all consciousnesses, of all other consciousnesses in the universe. And any idea of individualism is an illusion. And the Panchao system will add a few things not there in earlier traditions of gradual paths to awakening, like the Visuddhimagga of Buddhaghosa. It will also incorporate and address the Confucian and Taoist native systems. Generally, the Panchao systems of China will put Confucian hungry ghosts at the bottom. Those are greedy criminal people who can't function in society. Next up is the Confucian personality that's a functional citizen and worker, but not very aware beyond their duties in society. Then the Taoist, in the Buddhist systematizations, are aware of the larger reality of nature, but not aware of no self. All of this culminating in the one mind of the universe doctrines at the top of their system. Tibetans will have their own systems, as they all do. The Madhyamaka school in this tradition will be seen as a negation of any conception or imagery in one's mind prior to the positive assertion of the Buddha nature and this one mind of the universe. So the Zen school is the one that arguably will incorporate the largest number of Taoist elements. It was brought by Bodhidharma, none other than that figure who originated in Kanchipuram in South India and knew the Theravada world quite well, but makes his way through Central Asia all the way to China, where he is known as the blue-eyed barbarian. And one of his observations was to see that the monks sat too much, and he thought to incorporate elements of kinetic movement that he could see in the Taoist traditions of China into Buddhism. And this begins Buddhist martial arts, something that seems a bit odd for a tradition claiming the Buddha as its founder. And for the Zen practitioner, fancy doctrines, these are distractions from reality which is here and now. And one can be aware completely in this present moment. There's no need to wait for reincarnation. They will develop the doctrine of no mind, kind of conflicting with the doctrine of one mind. The Zen practitioners will claim that there is no mind in the universe, and this idea of no mind will feed into the martial arts, the idea that too much mind will spoil fighting or anything one is doing in this world. And in the Chan, Zen, or Dhyana meditation tradition is a famous poetry battle where Shenshue expresses the one mind doctrine, talking about the individual shining their mind like a mirror. The mind is a mirror bright, let not dust upon it a light. But Huineng, the common rice pounder in the monastery, not the fancy scholar, common theme in Zen, the common guy is the real deal. Huineng writes the next day his own poem. There is no mirror bright, no lampstand. What could it exist upon? If there's no lampstand for the mind, how could there be a mind? In other words, the mind would be dependent on the lampstand of this body. And he's saying there is neither lampstand nor mirror or mind. Therefore, how could dust land on it or defilements, leading to the very at odds with most Buddhist traditions idea that everything is enlightened just as it is, even if it's defiled and unawakened, if we knew it at the bottom level from a standpoint of no mind. Or we could say, to translate into Taoism, if we could know the unmanifest Tao. So the gradualist approach and the one-mind doctrine will become popular in the north, but in the south we'll see this southern school of Huineng take hold and become dominant. In the Chan, Zen, meditation tradition, is also the use of a Confucian element. Confucian scholars loved bringing public cases where they would argue both sides and determine who's right. But the Kung An, as it's called, was turned into a bit of a joke, one might say, through the Zen tradition, where instead of logical, rational arguments leading to conclusions, the Zen koans seem to be nonsensical. The most famous one is, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. What could that mean? It sounds pretty bad for the Buddha. Who would say that as a Buddhist? The idea behind that koan is to escape thinking and get rid of the idea that there's a being up here that's different from me down here. We should kill that idea of a being better than me or anyone, because the universe has no hierarchies in its barest nature. And worst of all, what is Buddha? The monk asked Master Unman, a famous collection of dialogues. And Master Unman replied, Buddha is a poop cleaning stick, the kind of defiled stick the peasants would use to clean manure from the roads. Again, what did he mean by that? He meant that, in fact, Buddha awakening is found everywhere in the most defiled objects, not just in the minds of master meditators. And Zen, unlike the other traditions, calls itself a special transmission outside of the scriptures because it's thought that the truth of Buddhism cannot be taught in words, but must be passed down from student to disciple. And these koans are directed at a pupil, and the master is determining, based on the intuition of the teacher, whether the student has really understood Zen, Chan, or not. So no other tradition has anything like this. And then that brings us to the dark period of Buddhism in China. While it had its heyday in the 6th, 7th, 8th century, with Emperor Wuzong, we see 3 years of persecution of Buddhism, 842 to 845. He will destroy 4,600 monasteries and force the monks back to work on the advice of his Taoist scholars, who urged him to think of removing black or Buddhism from China would lead to an immortal life for the emperor. And then sociologically, the Chan sects tended to live in the distant forest monasteries. They survived. And the Pure Land traditions, so popular among peasants, were kept alive because of the peasants. But the elite schools that established themselves in the rich urban monasteries of China will largely be destroyed in this period, along with, for example, Tantric Buddhist traditions will disappear during this persecution period. And of course, I'd like to tell students every culture has some kind of feminine divine figure. We've got the Virgin Mary in the West, the goddess Kali, among so many others in the Hindu world. And for the Chinese, it is this figure Guan Yin, so famous, truly a globally known female savior figure. Guan Yin is said to be she who hears the cries of the world. She's thought to be the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, famous from Indian fame and Central Asian Mahayana Buddhism, becomes conflated with this female figure we see in China. We're told that she left the life of the court as a princess to become a Buddhist nun against her father's wishes. But on hearing her father was dying from some mysterious disease, she came back and cut off her own arms to save her father somehow. And as she's floating into space to remain with all living beings till they all attain awakening. And as she's floating into space, her father asks her why she did this, made this great sacrifice. And she said, I am going to remain in this world until all living beings have attained to full awakening, where she lives today and is still prayed to by countless millions of East Asian Mahayana Buddhists. And you can see her statue in Theravada countries as well. In this later period after the persecution, while Confucianism in Taoism influenced Buddhism, it also goes the other way around, and we'll talk about Neo-Confucianism in this period, which is Confucianism having undergone the thorough scrutiny of Indian Buddhist logic, with a lot of changes coming from that. Vietnam's history largely follows the history of Southeast Asian Theravada Buddhism in the south, and in the north, where China tended to dominate the country, we see the increasing presence of the Mahayana tradition, notably the Zen Chan meditation sect, known in Vietnamese as Tien sect. So the South Vietnam maintains closer connections with the rest of the Theravada world, although there too Pure Land and Zen traditions will infiltrate, and there will be a great mixing in Vietnam. In Korea, we'll see the strange appearance of state Buddhism. All three of the three kingdoms in Korea viewed Buddhism as a unifying force, cohering a disparate tribal society. The fact of its Indian origins also gave some strength to the movement in the face of Chinese domination. The shamanism native to Korean tribal culture was never destroyed. Buddhism doesn't destroy the pagan religions, but does tend to move them to the side and marginalize them, and that's what happens to Buddhism in Korea. But the schools are increasingly harmonized with each other to create a single unified Buddhism for the Korean government. And as everywhere in Korea, we'll see examples of fabulous Buddhist art, but again, the Buddhas always look remarkably like the people who make them wherever they go. And similar themes as we saw in China, debates between sudden versus gradual approaches, or analytic and gradual versus synthetic emphasis on the one mind of the universe. These Chinese features will all be repeated in Korea as variations on the same themes. So Buddhism will be a governing ideology through Korea, and the establishment of woodblock printing will spread Buddhist texts far and wide through the rest of Asia. Jinul will create a synthesis of all the Buddhist sects under the rubric of the Son, again the same word Zen or Chan or meditation form of Buddhism, and then create the Jogye order. And of course he will say, so irreverently like these Zen guys do, the sutras are urine left behind by an old barbarian. So again, an emphasis on direct here and now experience, like we saw already emerged in China, will be directly imported to Korea. Japan will be more of the same, an importation of all the Chinese schools, including that old Theravada sect, the Madhyamaka, Yogacara. All of them will be imported in Japan, but unlike Korea, where we saw the creation of a government system under a unified form of Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, all the sects will each maintain their distinctiveness. We can even call Japan a museum of Buddhism for the fact of having preserved some forms that died out elsewhere. And Japan will even maintain the Tantric Buddhism that will die out in Korea and China, and never have a huge career in Vietnam either. It will, however, of course, in our next unit, loom large in Central Asia. Even this Tantric Buddhism, though, still borrows the Chinese idea of the one mind, personified as Mahavairochana, the great illumination, equated with the sun, and of course, famously, the land of the rising sun, and the sun on the flag itself means that Buddhism does get involved with the government and ideology, as it does everywhere, as much as Buddhist thinkers try to keep it out. Kukai, or sea sky, the tantric practitioner, will import so many Buddhist traditions and sects into Buddhism along with the Tantric Buddhism. And the other, perhaps greatest hero of Japan is Saicho, who brought the one vehicle Tiantai, or Heavenly Terrace School, to Japan along with Chinese tea. Shinran will emerge in Japan as a special kind of Pure Land teacher. Shinran will leave the elite monastery, realizing in his mind that indeed Buddha is with the common people. Why? Because the common people are less arrogant than the scholars or the city people or rich people. So he left the monastery behind, got married, and had a child, Zenran, who will rebel against him later. We can see him here wearing peasant garb because he is a populist leader of Buddhism. In his view, the most sinful people are closest to Buddha because of their lack of ego, in his opinion. In the Kamakura period, Dogen will become perhaps the best known Zenist in the West. He will talk about the dropping off of mind and body in Zazen, or Zen meditation. And here we can see the three distinct characters, Shinran and Dogen the Zenist, and finally we have the really odd one out in the whole history of Buddhism, Nichiren, seen here looking rather angry and holding a scroll in his hand. That scroll is the Lotus Sutra, and he claims apart from the Lotus Sutra no one can attain awakening. And because the Lotus Sutra teaches that all beings will lead to awakening, so if you don't follow that, then you're not going with the flow of Buddhism. This is the only scripture-centered form of Buddhism quite like that. And Nichiren is upholding the Lotus Sutra, which has been called the gospel of all Asia. Well, that's not very accurate, but it does get to the importance that the Lotus Sutra, with its teaching of many vehicles to awakening, but that they're all eventually just one vehicle to awakening, made the Lotus Sutra the most popular in East Asia. And so there you have it. The masses of peasants will follow the Pure Land. The elite samurai of Japan will follow Zen, as will the warrior Shaolin traditions. And finally, the odd one out in the whole Buddhist world, there's no teacher like Nichiren. So now we leave East Asian Buddhism and we travel to Central Asia and visit the final big development in Buddhism to date, the Vajrayana, or diamond vehicle, also known as the Tantric path. So we will return visiting Tibet, Mongolia, and Manchuria for our final major development of Buddhism.